Howdy folks, welcome back. It's Trammell Web Dev here, and in today's episode of JavaScript 101, we're going to be talking all about arrays and objects. In the last episode, we talked about variables and the different types of data that you can store within them, but today we're going to talk about objects and arrays, which are a way to group data together that have like properties. So let's start with arrays. So in our example here, we have this variable webtech, and it contains an array that holds a couple strings. So the first string we have is JavaScript, then HTML, then CSS. So arrays are notated by this square bracket right here, and then we have an item inside with a comma separating each individual item that's in there. So arrays use indexes in order to notate which position each item is. So for example, if I wanted to access the first property in the array, I would need to access the 0 index. Arrays start at 0 and just keep going up. So you might be confused thinking, well, this is the first item in the array, so I would assume it would have an index of 1. Well, the first index is always going to be 0, so just remember that. So in this little example I have right here, this would show what the position of each of these values would be. So the first index we have is 0. That would pull out JavaScript. The second index we have is 1. That would retrieve HTML, and the third index we have is 2, and that would retrieve CSS. So let's say I wanted to grab JavaScript and print it to the console. So I can use my console log, and inside of there I can call the variable webtech, and then use my square bracket notation and pass the index inside. So since I want to get the first item from the array, I'm going to use 0. So now when I save it, we should see JavaScript appear down here in the console. Perfect. So now if I want to print CSS to the console, I'll again call my variable, use my array notation, and pass in the index of CSS. So since CSS is the third property, I know that arrays start at 0. I can count 0, 1, 2, and that will retrieve CSS. So arrays are very special in that they come with several different methods that allow you to manipulate the items inside. So for example, one method we have is push, and push allows you to add new values to the array. So I'll first access my property here, webtech, and then I'll use a period. Now the period is going to allow me to add to access any of the methods that are available on this type of variable. So you'll notice that once I hit period, a bunch of suggestions popped up in VS Code, and these are all different methods that are available to an array specifically. So now I can say push, which is the method I want to use to add something to the array. I'm going to add a pair of parentheses, and you'll also notice that when I do this, VS Code pops up with a little helper. Now this is a really handy feature as it kind of helps you remember what am I supposed to pass in. So if you look at where it says push and it has the parentheses, I'm going to pass in a new string called TypeScript. And by passing this into adding this inside the parentheses, it's now going to add TypeScript into my array. So if I were to console log my webtech variable, save it, we now have 4 items in the array, and TypeScript is now added at the end. So since TypeScript and JavaScript are pretty much the same thing, just TypeScript adds types to JavaScript, we're going to go ahead and remove JavaScript from the array since we're just going to be using TypeScript. So in order to do that, I'm going to use another array method. This one's called splice. So I'm going to say webtech.splice. And again, when I open my parentheses, it's going to give me a little reminder of how to use it. So this one actually takes 2 arguments. Previously, we only passed 1 argument into push, which was the item to add to the array. Now we need to specify 2 arguments, and those can be separated by a comma. So the first argument we have here for splice is going to be the location where we're starting from. And this is the index where we want to start looking at. And then the second item is how many items to the right we want to delete. So since JavaScript is the first item in the array, I'm going to start at 0 since it's in the 0 index. And I only want JavaScript to be deleted, so I'm going to say 0, 1. Now, if I did 2, it would remove JavaScript and HTML, but I only want JavaScript deleted, so I'm going to make that a 1 because I want 1 item to be deleted at the 0 position. So now if I console log this again and save it, you'll now see we have an array of just HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. So what happens if we want to access each item individually inside of an array and do something with it? So in this example, we're going to just print each name out individually. So instead of having to write console log webtech index 0, console log webtech index 1, because we may not know how many items are in an array, and we definitely don't want to assume that we're always going to have 3 items in our array. Eventually, I may add more web technologies to this array, or I might remove some technologies from this array. So what we're going to use is another array method called for each. So again, I'm going to call webtech, use my period, and then I'm going to say for each. Now, for each is a bit special because it uses a callback function. We haven't really talked about functions yet, so I'm not going to go very deep into detail on how they work because we're going to save that for another episode. But basically, we're going to add in a pair of parentheses, we're going to use an arrow, and then we're going to open up a pair of curly braces. Now, inside our parentheses, we need to add in a variable that we can use to access whatever index we're currently on. So in this instance, since I have an array of web technologies, I'm going to call this variable tech. And now, when I loop over an array, it's going to be kind of repeating over the contents that are inside. So the first time I loop over the array, tech is going to equal JavaScript. The second time I loop over the array, tech is going to equal HTML. And the third time, tech is going to equal CSS, because tech just stands for the index that's currently in the loop. The for each is going to look at each individual index. So whatever index is being looked at, that's what tech is going to equal. So now I can just say console log tech. And once I save this, it's going to print each individual item from my array, so HTML, CSS, and TypeScript, on their own line. And that's that. Now, there's definitely more you can do inside of a for each. For example, if I wanted to retrieve the index, I could pass a second argument in here and say index. And by adding the second argument, this is always going to return the actual index that's being looked at. So I can go ahead and change this and say index. And I'm just going to use a simple concatenation here, using my plus signs, and we're going to have another episode on operators, so if this doesn't quite make sense, don't worry, it will. So now when I save it, I should see the index, colon, and then the name of the tech. So I have 0, 1, and 2, with the index prepended right before the property name. So that's arrays. So while arrays are good to kind of group like information together, you might need something a little bit more specific from time to time. So let's look at our next example. This is an object. So objects represent a collection of key value pairs. The key being the name that's used to associate or to retrieve the value, and the value being the actual value that's stored under that key. So in this instance, name would be a key. Hunter Trammell would be the value. And you can add as many of these key value pairs as you want to an object, and you can add different data types as a value. So for example, name has a value of a string, age is a value of a number, skills is an array, and is kickass is a boolean. So now, similar to arrays, I'm able to access each of these different properties, but I use a little bit of a different notation. So think about the different properties as being nested. So if I want to access name, I first have to go through developer in order to access name. So I can't just say console log name, because it doesn't know what name is. What I need to tell it is where name is stored. So I would say developer, and then use a period to notate I'm going in. So developer.name should print out Hunter Trammell in the console. And then if I want to print out my age, like I did with my name, I would say developer.age, since age is the property and developer is the object. So now what if I wanted to print these out in the same line? So in the previous example, we used just some simple concatenation, so the plus sign to add in our value. But now I'm going to show you a different way to kind of merge variables together as a string. So we're going to use a backtick, and this is called string interpolation. So we're going to add in a $sign and then open up a curly brace, and you'll notice that it's a different color in the editor because it works a little bit differently. So within the backticks, whatever I write is considered a string. But whatever I write in between the curly braces, I have access to variables. So I can say developer.name. And then outside of the curly braces, it's just a normal string. And I can add multiple of these $ curly braces. Again, say developer.age. Now, when I save it, you should see Hunter Trammell is 27 years old. Pretty cool. So let's say I wanted to print all of my skills inside my developer object to the console. So we've already seen how we can print out each individual item of an array, and it's no different. So we would say developer, since that's where our data is stored, that we go ahead and nest into skills. And now since skills is an array, we can use the for each property. And we're going to provide a value for our iteration. So each individual item in the array could be considered a skill. So we're going to use that as our keyword. So for each skill inside our skills array, we want to console.log the skill. So now you should see coding, problem solving, and eating Taco Bell pop up in our console. Bada bing. So now what happens if we want to modify a value inside of our object? So let's say it's my birthday. I'm no longer 27, I'm 28. So I need to update my developer object to reflect that. So to do that, I can just say developer.age equals, and then assign a new value. Now I could just say 28, but since we want our JavaScript to be somewhat dynamic and not necessarily hard-coded, we're going to use a JavaScript shorthand that's going to increment the value by 1 and reassign it. So if I say ++ developer.age, it's going to take the current value of developer.age, which is 27, and add 1 to it, and then reassign the value. So now if I console log developer.age, it should say 28. Perfect. So we've learned how to reassign a value. What about if we wanted to add a new value? I realized that after I built my object, well, I probably should have included a section there for a Twitter handle because a lot of developers use Twitter. So how do I add a new property to an object if I've already created the object? Easy. I can just say developer dot add in my new property name, so developer.twitter equals, and then I'm just going to provide a string of my Twitter username. So now if I console log my developer object, we'll be able to see this new property appear. So it's handy in the web console. You click this little triangle, and it'll actually expand this this object so that you can see all the different properties. So you'll notice that our age is now reflecting 28. Our skills is an array, which we can click to expand, and it shows us the indexes, similar to how we printed it out earlier. And then lastly, our new property, Twitter, is now reflecting in our object. And that's it. So now there's definitely more efficient ways to build objects in JavaScript, and we'll get to those once we start learning about classes. But for a basic overview of what arrays and objects do, this is it. So feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And as always, keep an eye out for the next episode of JavaScript 101. Thank you. Happy coding.